The palace walls had seen centuries of secrets, but nothing prepared them for the silence that blanketed Buckingham on that fateful night. Whispers grew louder in the corridors, servants exchanged nervous glances, and eyes turned toward Catherine, who carried in her hands not just a folder, but the power to unravel the monarchy. What she was about to reveal would shatter King Charles's composure in ways no one imagined. The atmosphere inside the palace was unlike anything seen in living memory. It was not the quiet of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that comes before a storm. Every clock tick echoed louder than usual. Every step across marble floors sounded like an omen. Even the most seasoned royal attendants, who had endured scandals and crises before, felt a strange unease settling over them. Their instincts whispered that something irreversible was about to occur. And then came Catherine, not in grandeur or with an entourage, but alone, carrying with her a sealed collection of documents that had been guarded closely for weeks. Her stride was deliberate, her expression calm yet unreadable, but her very presence carried weight. Staff members moved aside without being asked. They knew instinctively that what she carried was more dangerous than any headline, more destructive than any rumor. This was truth sharp, unforgiving, and impossible to silence. Meanwhile, in his private chambers, Charles was pacing. His footsteps traced a worn path across the carpet as his thoughts spiraled. He had been weighed down for weeks, his health adding fragility to his already strained state. His shoulders sagged beneath the burden of responsibility, but his heart carried a heavier load still, the gnawing fear that something was slipping beyond his control. Those closest to him had noticed the tension, his voice breaking in moments of frustration, the distant look in his eyes when matters of trust were raised. The silence of the palace mirrored the silence in his soul, and yet, within that stillness, a storm was forming. For this night was not just about his reign or his responsibilities. It was about the one truth he had avoided confronting for years. Camilla, the very name that had defined both scandal and survival within the monarchy, was about to reappear in a context darker than ever imagined. Catherine knew it too. Her decision to bring these documents tonight was not rash, but deliberate, carefully timed for the moment when the weight of proof would be undeniable. She understood the consequences. To expose betrayal at the highest level was to risk tearing the crown itself apart. But to remain silent was to allow deceit to spread like poison through the very foundation of the monarchy. The corridors outside whispered with speculation. Servants avoided meeting one another's eyes. Advisors who had caught the faintest rumors stood frozen in uncertainty. Everyone felt the same thing: dread. They sensed history was about to shift, though none of them could predict how. What Catherine held in her hands would either safeguard the monarchy's integrity or expose its most vulnerable wound to the world. And so the palace waited, silent, but alert, the kind of silence that carries within it the sound of 1,000 unspoken fears. All eyes turned toward the woman who had walked into the heart of power with a calm face and a folder of secrets. And as she prepared to present it to the king, one truth resonated. Nothing about this night would leave the crown untouched. But before the folder was opened, one question lingered in the air. What exactly had Camilla hidden for so long? For months, Catherine had remained silent, working quietly in the shadows. But while the world focused on her public grace, she was gathering fragments of truth letters, financial trails, testimonies that painted a portrait of betrayal. The folder she carried was no ordinary set of papers. It was the culmination of a hunt that had stretched across years, and every page brought her closer to a revelation that would fracture the monarchy at its core. Her journey into this hidden truth had not begun overnight. It started with whispers, subtle inconsistencies that most dismissed as harmless coincidences. Yet Catherine's instinct told her otherwise. She began arranging discreet conversations with trusted insiders, people who had served the crown for decades, those who had witnessed the unpolished truths beneath the monarchy's polished surface. What they shared with her was enough to send shivers down her spine. Fragments of letters, odd financial transfers, unexplained meetings in distant places. Each detail on its own seemed small, but together they hinted at something darker. Piece by piece, she collected these fragments, tracing them with the precision of someone who understood the stakes. And then, one night, her suspicions crystallized. Among the evidence placed before her lay documents that bore Camilla's unmistakable signature. Catherine stared at them in disbelief. This was not speculation, nor rumor, nor the idle talk of discontented staff. This was proof stark, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The woman who stood beside the king had left a trail, and Catherine had followed it to its devastating conclusion. The discovery was more than shocking. It was personal. Catherine knew the toll this revelation would take on Charles, who had built his later years around the fragile trust he placed in Camilla. She feared his reaction, feared the weight it would place on his already weary heart. For days she debated whether to bring the truth forward, torn between loyalty to the monarchy and compassion for a man who had endured scandal all his life. Yet deep down, she knew that silence would be the greater betrayal. And so, Catherine waited. She chose her moment with care, knowing timing was everything. To expose Camilla's actions too early risked disbelief, denial, and further division. But to wait too long meant allowing the monarchy to continue under the shadow of deception. It was a cruel balance, and Catherine bore it alone, carrying the folder with her like a weapon and a burden all at once. Every page told a story. Financial accounts quietly drained into places they should never have reached. Letters exchanged with names that carried dangerous weight. Testimonies from insiders who had seen too much but dared not speak aloud. With each revelation, the image of betrayal grew sharper, more undeniable, and infinitely more dangerous. Catherine understood that once these documents were revealed, there would be no turning back. The crown itself would be forced to face the truth. And so, in one quiet motion, Catherine laid the folder before Charles, his hands trembling before even touching it. He was not just a monarch at that moment, he was a husband facing the collapse of trust. As Charles opened the folder, the lines on his face deepened, his breath shortened, and his eyes glazed with disbelief. Every page turned was a dagger, each revelation stripping away his strength. And when he reached the final page, the king who had endured wars, scandals, and heartbreak finally broke. The silence inside the chamber was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper in Charles's trembling hands. His eyes darted across the damning words that Catherine had placed before him, each one exposing a side of Camilla he had fought so hard to deny existed. Meetings he was never told about, financial dealings that bypassed his knowledge, communications that painted a portrait of deception so complete that his heart could no longer shield itself from the truth. He had weathered storms before, but this storm struck at the very core of his being. As the evidence unfurled, Charles's shoulders slumped, his regal posture dissolving into the frailty of a man undone. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His breath caught in uneven bursts, the weight of betrayal crushing the air from his lungs. He had defended Camilla for decades, against whispers, against judgment, against the unrelenting scorn of the public. And now, in the quiet of this night, the defense crumbled. The woman he had protected above all else had left him to face the devastation of her secrets. The muffled sounds of anguish began to escape the king's chamber, enough to stir those waiting just beyond the door. Servants exchanged worried glances, advisors shifted uncomfortably, but none dared intrude. They had heard cries in this palace before, but never from him, never from the man who had been trained his entire life to keep composure, to bury pain behind ceremony. Tonight, that mask had shattered. What echoed in those muffled cries was not only the grief of a monarch, It was the grief of a husband betrayed. For Catherine, standing in silence, the weight of history seemed to press down. The parallels were haunting. The monarchy had been shaken before by betrayal, from Edward's abdication to Diana's explosive revelations. Each time, the crown had staggered, but survived. Yet now, as Charles wept into the truth of Camilla's own actions, Catherine could not shake the feeling that this moment was different. This was not just the scandal of a marriage, it was the unraveling of trust that underpinned the monarchy itself. The folder lay open on the desk, its contents sprawled like shattered glass. Charles's eyes lingered on Camilla's signature, bold, undeniable, final. The sight hollowed him, erasing the fragile hope that perhaps there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding. His heart knew the truth even before his mind accepted it. The betrayal was real, and with that realization came the collapse of the man who had once stood unyielding in the face of duty. But the betrayal was not just personal. It carried consequences that threatened the very institution he swore to protect. The proof was damning. Hidden meetings, secret communications, and confidential exchanges that painted a chilling picture. What Catherine revealed was not a minor indiscretion, but a systematic betrayal, one that shook the foundation of trust inside the monarchy. Every detail was meticulously recorded, leaving no room for denial. And the most shocking twist? The betrayal reached far beyond Charles's marriage. It threatened the crown itself. Laid before the king were documents that left nothing to interpretation. They exposed a network of carefully orchestrated interactions, each one concealed beneath layers of secrecy. Camilla's name was woven through all signatures on letters, coded references in private exchanges, and financial transfers that bypassed royal protocols. The revelations were not the careless mistakes of a reckless woman, but the deliberate maneuvers of someone working with precision, as if building a separate empire in the shadows of the crown. Among the most damning pieces were financial records, tracing money into accounts linked not to official royal operations, but to a circle of figures with ties that raised suspicion. Catherine had followed the trail relentlessly, unraveling a pattern of manipulation that suggested Camilla had used her position not only to elevate herself, but also to channel influence where it did not belong. These were not isolated errors. They were threads of a tapestry designed to expand her reach at the expense of the monarchy's stability. Even more unsettling were the alliances hinted at in the correspondence. Letters revealed contacts with individuals outside the monarchy, names whispered in political and social circles that no queen consort should have been entangled with. Each page seemed to strip away the illusion of loyalty, revealing instead a woman who had cultivated secret understandings and backdoor agreements. The idea that such alliances could exist in silence, hidden even from the king, was devastating to the integrity of the crown. The hidden communications told their own damning story. In one exchange, Camilla's words betrayed a tone of authority that rivaled Charles himself, as though she viewed the monarchy less as a shared institution and more as a tool to be wielded. The messages spoke of promises, arrangements, and subtle manipulations that painted her not as a passive figure but as an architect of her own power. To see this in writing, in her own hand, was a crushing blow to Charles's spirit. The betrayal extended beyond personal pain and carried devastating consequences for the family's public image. For years, whispers had circled about Camilla Zoe's influence, her ambitions, her supposed disregard for the traditions that bound the monarchy together. Now, Catherine's evidence made those whispers thunder with undeniable clarity. The world would not see this as a private failing of marriage, it would see it as a corruption within the heart of the monarchy itself. What made the revelations even more unbearable was how seamlessly they aligned with long-standing rumors. The stories dismissed by advisors as petty gossip now resurfaced as undeniable truths, each one echoing through the palace walls like a prophecy fulfilled. Charles, once shielded by denial, now faced the horrifying reality that he had ignored signs that had been before him all along. And as the details spilled into the open, one chilling question arose. Had Charles been living a lie all along? While Charles collapsed under the weight of betrayal, Catherine stood unshaken. Her silence was not weakness, but power. Her presence a stark reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. she had carried this burden not for her own sake, but for the future of the monarchy. And in that moment, Catherine proved she was no longer just a duchess, nor just a princess. She was the protector of the crown. Her composure contrasted sharply with the king's unraveling grief. Where Charles trembled, Catherine remained still, her voice unspoken yet louder than any words could be. This was not indifference. It was resolved. She had known the devastation the truth would cause, but she also understood that to withhold it would doom the monarchy to rot from within. Catherine's choice was not born from cruelty, but from duty. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew the cost of truth and chose to bear it anyway. For years, she had been the one to balance the fragile scales of public image and private reality. But this night was different. No speech, no carefully crafted appearance could shield Charles from the storm Catherine had unleashed. And yet, she had not brought this forward to destroy him, but to save him, to save the crown. Her silence in that moment was not passive. It was active strength, the strength of a woman who knew that sometimes the only way to protect the future is to confront the painful present. In her stillness, echoes of Princess Diana could be felt, the same courage, the same determination to speak truth when silence would have been easier. But unlike Diana, Catherine was not standing against the monarchy, she was standing for it. Her actions were not meant to dismantle, but to rebuild, to strip away the shadows that had long haunted the palace halls. By confronting the betrayal, Catherine was placing herself in a lineage of women who had carried unimaginable burdens, but she was also carving her own path. The emotional intensity of the moment was undeniable. Catherine's eyes remained steady, as Charles's world seemed to collapse around him. Her compassion was not loud or sentimental. It was in the very act of revealing the truth when it mattered most. She understood his pain, but she also understood that protecting him from this revelation would only worsen the wound in time. Duty demanded courage, and she rose to that demand with an iron will disguised in calm silence. She had chosen this moment with precision. Not in the chaos of public life, not in the glare of cameras, but in the privacy of the palace walls, where truth could be confronted before it consumed them all. Catherine's decision was not about timing for herself, it was about timing for the monarchy. She knew that the longer betrayal remained hidden, the more dangerous it would become. This night was the point of no return, and Catherine embraced that inevitability without hesitation. And so, in her quiet strength, Catherine began to embody something larger than her title. She was no longer just the future queen consort. She was the figure holding the monarchy's fragile pieces together when the man who wore the crown could not. It was a silent coronation of strength, one that would foreshadow her rising role in the years to come. But Catherine's strength also meant she had to confront the inevitable storm that was about to explode outside the palace walls. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire through the palace. Guards stiffened, staff whispered, and aides rushed between rooms with pale faces. Something catastrophic had erupted behind closed doors, and it would not remain hidden for long. What Catherine had unveiled was more than betrayal. It was a scandal that threatened to topple Camilla's standing and drag the monarchy into its darkest hour since Diana's tragic revelations. Behind the gilded doors, fragments of raised voices leaked into the corridors, sharp enough for those nearby to recognize anger, grief, and confrontation. Servants, trained to be invisible, exchanged nervous glances as they caught phrases carried faintly through the air. The king's voice, usually measured and restrained, cracked with anguish. Catherine's steadier tones cut through, cold with conviction. No one heard Camilla's voice yet, but her absence only deepened the unease, as though the walls themselves were bracing for her arrival. Senior advisors, summoned in hushed urgency, gathered in adjoining chambers, their faces pale as parchment. These were men and women who had seen crises before, who had managed abdication whispers, divorces, and scandals that threatened the crown. But what they sensed now was different. This was not speculation to be spun, nor a minor fracture to be patched. It was a direct strike at the monarchy's core, one that left no easy path forward. The air was thick with dread, as though history itself was pressing down upon them, demanding to be repeated. The king's torment rippled through his advisors. Some urged silence, pleading to contain the matter before it spread. Others feared that silence itself would be the monarchy's undoing. The tension between Charles's personal despair and his duty as sovereign was unbearable. To expose Camilla was to risk shattering the monarchy's stability. To conceal her betrayal was to live a lie that would eventually devour them from within. Charles stood at the very crossroads where crown and heart collided, and the palace trembled under the weight of his indecision. But time was slipping away. The palace was a fortress, yet nothing within its walls remained secret for long. Already, whispers filtered beyond the staff, trickling toward journalists who always seemed to hover near royal grounds, hungry for cracks in the facade. The risk of leaks grew by the minute. Every word spoken too loudly, every glance exchanged in the corridors, was another thread unraveling. Soon, the truth, or some version of it, would reach the outside world, and the monarchy's carefully guarded image would ignite in scandal. The fear of public outrage loomed like a storm on the horizon. The people had forgiven Charles once, after Diana's death, only reluctantly accepting Camilla into the royal fold. But betrayal on this scale would be unforgivable. The nation that had barely healed from the past would see this as history repeating itself, with devastating consequences. Whispers of Diana's name already echoed in conversations, comparisons that stung like an old wound reopening. The monarchy had been wounded by scandal before, but this time the cut went deeper. And so the palace shifted into chaos, scrambling to control what could not be contained. Advisors drafted contingency plans, courtiers whispered of abdication, and staff braced for the fallout of truths too heavy to suppress. Yet beneath the chaos, one realization haunted them all. The most explosive moment had not yet occurred. Yet, even as the palace scrambled, the most dangerous confrontation had not yet happened. Camilla herself had not faced Catherine's proof. And then, the doors opened. Camilla entered the room, her confidence radiating until her eyes landed on the folder in Charles's trembling hands. The silence was suffocating. For years, she had built her image as unshakable, untouchable, irreplaceable. But Catherine's revelation had torn the mask away. In one of the most dramatic royal confrontations in living memory, Camilla was forced to face the undeniable truth of her betrayal exposed before the king himself. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. Denial spilled from her lips like fire, words sharpened by desperation. She accused Catherine of lies, of manipulation, of conspiring to destroy her reputation. But the force of her outrage could not drown out the truth lying open on the table. The documents were irrefutable, and her fury only confirmed what she feared most: that the carefully crafted image she had built was unraveling in front of the two people who could dismantle it completely. Charles, broken yet defiant, demanded answers through tears. His voice cracked under the weight of his anguish, but his questions were sharp, relentless. How long had this gone on? Why had she concealed so much from him? What had she truly wanted from their union? Each question cut deeper, leaving Camilla cornered, her authority shrinking as the man she once controlled with subtle influence now confronted her with raw, unfiltered rage. For the first time in decades, it was not Charles bending to her narrative, it was Charles forcing her to face him. Catherine, unflinching, held her ground. She did not raise her voice, nor did she falter. With quiet conviction, she presented the evidence piece by piece, ensuring that every denial from Camilla was met with proof too precise to dismiss. Each signature, each letter, each account was placed before the king with surgical precision, stripping away Camilla's defenses layer by layer. Where Camilla's outrage was loud, Catherine's strength was silent but devastating, leaving no room for ambiguity. Camilla, sensing her crumbling position, attempted to deflect blame. She spoke of pressure, of enemies who sought to see her fall, of being misunderstood and manipulated by those who resented her place in the monarchy. But the excuses fell flat in the face of evidence. The more she spoke, the more transparent her desperation became, and the more apparent it was that she no longer held command of the room. The emotional power had shifted. Catherine was no longer simply the bearer of truth. She was in control of the narrative itself. The future of the monarchy no longer revolved around Camilla's presence, but around Catherine's strength and Charles's decision. The queen consort, once seen as unshakable, now stood trembling, her reign of influence slipping through her fingers. The confrontation had not just exposed betrayal, it had realigned the very balance of power within the palace walls. And as the silence thickened once more, the question of Camilla's survival within the monarchy hung like a sword above her head. Her future was no longer guaranteed, it was a thread waiting to snap. But this confrontation was only the beginning. What came next would shake the world outside those palace gates. When whispers escape Buckingham, they do not remain whispers for long. The betrayal Catherine revealed and the king's breakdown began seeping into the public sphere. Newspapers caught hints, tabloids speculated, and citizens buzzed with disbelief. The monarchy was no longer insulated. The world was about to see Charles not as a sovereign, but as a man betrayed, and Catherine as the guardian of untold truths. Within hours, the media descended like a storm. Headlines screamed of unrest behind palace walls, of shouting matches, tears, and sealed folders that carried secrets too powerful to suppress. The tabloids fed the frenzy, sketching lurid tales of betrayal, while broadsheets cautiously framed the story as one of the gravest challenges to the monarchy in decades. Reporters lingered at every gate, broadcasters interrupted programming, and across the world, people turned their eyes to Britain, demanding answers. Public sympathy leaned swiftly toward Charles. The sight of a monarch long portrayed as stoic, now breaking under the weight of personal betrayal, moved hearts across the nation. For many, he was no longer just king. He was a husband who had placed loyalty above all else and received devastation in return. His fragility humanized him, and for the first time in years, citizens who once questioned his reign whispered words of compassion. The crown, in its most fragile moment, suddenly seemed closer to its people. Catherine, meanwhile, emerged as an unshakable force. Though she had not spoken publicly, her role in exposing the betrayal was whispered with reverence. Admirers hailed her as courageous, a woman who dared to protect not only her family, but the monarchy's very foundation. Her silence spoke louder than speeches. She had not sought glory, yet the people began to see her as the stabilizing figure the crown desperately needed. Her image rose, not as a mere consort, but as the embodiment of integrity within a fractured royal house. Camilla, however, faced a tide of outrage. Once tolerated by a public willing to overlook the past, she now stood accused in the court of opinion. Demands for accountability swelled, with voices calling for her removal from royal duties and questioning whether she could ever remain within the monarchy. Every past whisper about her influence resurfaced, now framed as undeniable proof that she had overstepped, deceived, and corrupted the trust placed in her. The scandal traveled beyond Britain's borders, igniting coverage across Europe, America, and the Commonwealth. International commentators framed it as unprecedented, a betrayal that struck at the very heart of tradition. Analysts speculated about abdication, succession, and the monarchy's survival. Some questioned whether such an institution, already fragile in a modern age, could withstand yet another storm. The crown, once seen as untouchable, now trembled in the eyes of the world. And as the storm raged outside, inside the palace, Catherine knew one final act would decide the monarchy's survival. In the ashes of betrayal, the monarchy faced a choice: collapse under the weight of secrets, or rise with the truth. Charles sat broken, but Catherine stood firm, reminding him and the world that survival demanded courage. The betrayal had left scars that would never heal, but it had also unveiled a new force within the royal family. And for the first time, the crown's future rested not in tradition, but in Catherine's hands. Charles struggled to steady himself, torn between grief and responsibility. His trust, once given so freely, had been shattered, and with it, his authority seemed fragile. Yet, even in his weakness, the eyes of the nation turned toward him, demanding a king who could endure. He knew that rebuilding faith would be a battle fought not just in public, but within his own heart. Catherine, however, emerged as the monarchy's quiet protector. Where others faltered, she stood unyielding. She embodied a strength that carried symbolic weight, not through words but through presence. To the public, she was no longer a supporting figure. She was the steady hand guiding the crown through turmoil. And in the halls of power, her influence began to eclipse those who had once sought to overshadow her. Camilla, by contrast, stood isolated. The betrayal she had hoped to keep hidden had instead cast her into uncertainty. Her place in the monarchy no longer assured. For her, the question was not whether she would remain in power, but whether she could remain at all. The legacy of the monarchy itself now trembled. Betrayal had threatened to undo centuries of tradition. Yet in Catherine's rise, whispers of a new monarchy began to form, a monarchy not defined by secrecy, but by the courage to confront it. She had not asked for this role, but fate had chosen her to carry it. And yet, one shadow remained. If betrayal this deep could be uncovered, what other secrets still lingered in the palace walls, waiting for the moment to strike? The betrayal had been revealed. The king had broken down. But one truth remained. In the world of royalty, secrets never die. They only wait to be exposed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.